lingüística.
So we have this article here on so-called Spanglish by Ricardo and Nancy. And I mean, the abstract really tells you what it's about, and it's a very interesting article. So as I'm doing a little critique of sections, I really do think they did a good job at really explaining this. So the gist of this, to a point, I'm not going to ruin it completely, but obviously it's talking about the term Spanglish. And what it's referring to is that the term Spanglish is not an appropriate term to be using. And they go through and they present evidence and they show why. And part of the reason is because whenever the term Spanglish is used, it's usually to refer to Spanish speakers of the United States, including Puerto Rico, of course. But when other individuals do it, they're generally not branded as speakers of Spanglish, regardless of the country. If it's somebody from Mexico, Spain, Colombia, Argentina, Peru, it doesn't matter. They're generally not branded as speakers of Spanglish. They're just Spanish speakers. And if English speakers mix Spanish into their lexicon, they're not accused of speaking Spanglish either, or let's say Angloñol, right? The language of the Anglos. And the reason why is if we look at Spanish, Glish being influenced by English. So the language being influenced first, followed by the language influencing. So if we were to flip that, English being influenced by Spanish, right? Nobody uses that term. And of course, in modern time, it's more common for Spanish speakers to use English terms, but it makes sense. The English-speaking world does dominate technology, right? Or technology is dominated by English-speaking world, and some of the strongest economies tend to be in the English-speaking world. So from that perspective, it makes sense. And the introduction really establishes this, how this is really about Spanish speakers in the United States. So it uses North American Latino community as the group of focus here. And it also talks about the mastery of the language, which is something very, very important, especially if we think of registries from a linguistics perspective. And before I continue on, thinking about registries, somebody can be dressed, if we think of clothing as language, somebody can be dressed, right? I'm dressed right now. I'm dressed all right for this video. Could I dress better? Yes, of course, I could dress better, but still all right. If I were to go to the grocery store, I would be all right, right? This would be fine. Could I dress better? Of course I could, but this would be fine. What if I decided to go to a wedding? Certainly not, right? Wouldn't be caught dead doing this, or wearing this to a wedding, or a quinceañera, sweet 16. Would I go swimming in a pool like that? No. Would I go swimming at all dressed like this? Absolutely not, right? I wouldn't go in the water swimming like this. So think of that as registries. But somebody could have a bathing suit, which is great. You can go swimming. Somebody can have casual clothing, casual moments, and somebody could have maybe nicer clothing for certain events. It's still the same individual, different types of clothing that the individual wears depending on the occasion, depending on how casual, how formal it might be, or the requirements for that situation. For example, most of us speak English or Spanish or whatever language. Let's focus on English for now. Does that mean we are fully competent in speaking in legal terms? Probably not, unless we were trained. Medical terms? Probably not, unless we were trained. But we are still English speakers. We're still competent English speakers, just not necessarily in those fields because we have not learned that registry yet. And that is one of the points that they make quite well. Spanish speakers are Spanish speakers. It's just a different registry. And there are many, many variants. So popular forms of Spanish, for example, right? There's different ways to speak, to write, just like in English. So just like English has varieties depending on where in the United States, West Coast, East Coast, Midwest, right? Southwestern US. Then we can go across the pond. England, Scotland, Ireland, right? Wales, right? Compare those 4 places and how similar, how different are they? And we can go other places too, right? We can go to the southern hemisphere if we wanted and other parts of the world. But these are some things to keep in mind. There will be popular variations depending on where one goes with the language, especially with a language spoken by so many people around the world that extends a geographic area that is quite large. Now, one of the things that they mentioned, and to be honest, they have a very good point, is Spanglish is really just a term of disparagement. That's really what it is. And that's one of the reasons why later on they say it should be avoided really in their conclusion. But I'm going to hold off on everything in the conclusion because it's usually used to criticize the way Spanish speakers in the US speak. And there could be some ideology in politics, which they describe here briefly. And some of it, to be honest, has been around for quite a while in the United States, maybe not as much anymore compared to other generations. But I do remember, for example, several times by several people being asked, well, what Spanish do you speak? And then they would go off. Was it Mexican Spanish, Colombian Spanish, Peruvian Spanish, depending on where the individual was from or ethnically from, even if you were born and raised here in the US, right? And then they would say, or is it Spain Spanish? Because, Spain Spanish is the correct Spanish. Usually these individuals did not speak Spanish or really had no clue. It's just very little knowledge of the language. But this is the way it was used. And it was generally used to criticize the way individuals spoke Spanish here in the United States. And keep in mind that the majority of Spanish speakers who immigrate to the US happen to be Mexican. So this is a really easy way to criticize the way they speak. Now, although they don't mention this, keep in mind that although it is illegal in many places to prohibit somebody from speaking a language, it's not illegal to discourage the individual by shaming the way they speak. And this is an important thing that once we get to the conclusion, I'm going to mention that I think they do a very good job. Now, here on part 5, I actually think they do a great job, even though it's short. But Spanglish, if somebody's going to claim it's a language, the question is, where are the grandchildren? And this is an interesting point. For example, Latin is a dead language. The reason why it's a dead language is because, well, nobody grows up with it speaking at home, right? No mothers teach their children Latin at home. People who speak Latin, to my knowledge, learn it in school. That's why it's a dead language, right? It still exists, but it doesn't get inherited. That's the reason why. So if we think of Spanish, if we want to say it's a language, well, where are the grandchildren? And there really aren't any, if we really want to be truthful, because Spanglish, like we said, Spanish influenced by English. So the language the individual is speaking would be Spanish influenced by English. And I've already established when it's the other way around, we generally don't use the term. But if we think of the grandfather comes to the United States, Spanish speaker. Grandfather's a Spanish speaker. The son. The son now speaks Spanish and English, right? We'll learn English at school. The grandchild will probably just speak English. That is the most common. Now, it is possible that the grandchild might still keep some words in Spanish. For example, the individual might say things such as, oh yes, I went to visit my abuela, she's doing very, very well. Or yes, my tia made this for me. Something like that. But usually that's as far as we go. So it's not very common to find 3 or 4 generations of Spanish speakers in the United States. It really isn't. But you do find them in other countries, and that's something they emphasize. So you go to Spain, very common. Mexico, very common. Colombia, etc. Right? So for you to find 3 generations of Spanglish speakers, that's going to be a tough one, because at some point it's really a stepping stone to English. That's in essence why they say Spanglish is not a language. So another critique, and I know I've already skipped sections, is another problem with Spanglish is this term is not well defined. And because it's not well defined, it can also cause misunderstanding. Like, what does this term actually mean? Is it just because I'm using a term or two from English when speaking Spanish? Or is it because I mix it constantly, every other word, syntax? I mean, I'm exaggerating to a point, but that's the idea. What is Spanglish? Because if it's mixing, we're going to run into problems really, really fast. And the reason why is individuals who mix English terms into Spanish when speaking Spanish, that's not limited to people in the United States. People in other Spanish-speaking countries do it as well, and they do it quite often. And many times, those terms are now the words they use. It's part of the language. And keep in mind that English has borrowed a lot of words as well, as I will mention later on. So, local varieties of Spanish. There are many, many local varieties of Spanish. Just like I mentioned, English, right, is spoken by a lot of people, very diverse parts of the world. I mentioned US, and then went to the other side of the puddle. Spanish the same way. It is spoken by in over 20 countries by millions of people, over 500 million people. You're going to have variations. I mean, they will exist. So there's going to be a lot of lexical examples. And if we continue on to lexical borrowings, and I'm just sort of summing part of this and then doing my critique at the time, but they do a very good job. Whenever languages come together and they share a border, there's going to be borrowings. Some of the borrowings, for example, here in this section, section 8, right? There are borrowings from Guarani that is mentioned, from German, from, well, of course, English as well. But if we think of Portuguese, right? Individuals who live near a Portuguese-speaking country. So let's look at River Plate, the River Plate area, and then we have Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil. Some people will say brasileiro instead of brasileño when speaking Spanish. This is a borrowing from Portuguese. And the Portuguese speakers will do the same. They might borrow something from Spanish, which is normal when languages come in contact. They are going to borrow from each other, right? Some might borrow more than others, but, still. And then it talks about certain expressions. Chévere, right? This is a big one, right? Very common. So borrowings occur in all places. But here is the thing. When a term from English is borrowed into Spanish, many times people will say that's Spanglish. But if we go to Argentina and we have a steak, and then afterwards we go to the living room, you will hear un bife for a steak, and you will hear a living for living room, as opposed to un bistec and la sala. Now it is important to note that bistec does come from beef steak, and then English borrowed it from French, beef steak. So there's borrowings there as well from other languages. So you're borrowing from a borrowing. This is normal. This happens. Now, say we go to Mexico. We can go to a meeting, if it's a political meeting, for example, right? Or an official meeting of some type of body, union, government, etc. Instead of reunión or something similar, they will say un meeting. Vamos a tener un meeting. Nobody calls this Spanish. And to be honest, I would say most people in Mexico, especially in the cities, mostly in the cities, instead of saying estacionar, estacionamiento, they will say el parking, right? I don't remember if it was Guatemala where they said el parqueo. It was somewhere as well. I don't remember. Maybe it was the Caribbean. I have to remember where I heard it. But Spain, right? Spain also borrows many things like that, and they do other interesting things. And probably the most common term you will hear in this generation right now will be flipar, to flip out. Me estás flipando. Me voy a flipar. You will hear this, but nobody says, well, people in Spain don't really speak Spanish. They speak Spanglish. And that's part of what they're trying to argue, and these authors do a very good job on how Spanglish is really a term of disparagement, and it's really targeted toward Spanish speakers in the United States. Now, if you look at morphology, there are variations if one goes country to country, right? This happens. Even in English, it happens as well. But in Spanish, for example, some people might say explosionar instead of explotar, right? That happens. If we talk about vocabulary, so let me focus on vocabulary. This is very interesting because I keep mentioning that borrowings occur, but if we think about it, English speakers or English in the United States, nobody said, you're not speaking English when somebody said fashionista or barista. Nobody said, well, this is Anglo-Italian, because you're borrowing that suffix from Italian. Or maybe it was borrowed from Spanish, Engleñol, right? Took the English language, mixed it with Spanish. Nobody says that. And if we look at a lot of terms that are popular now, we have the Florida Gators, right? We have Gatorade, which Gator, aid. And gator, well, alligator, el lagarto. Came from Spanish, but nobody says, you're not speaking English, that's Spanglish. No, nobody does that. Nobody goes to Ford and says that. It's like, what do you mean it's the F-150 Lariat? It should be the F-150 Rope. Lariat, that's Spanglish, or that's Engleñol, because it comes from La Reata. And if we think of famous writers, Louis L'Amour, Zane Grey, great novels, and they use a lot of terms that were borrowed from English. Now, certain terms are no longer used as much, like Otheguy, that's fine, but buckaroo, we still have that. Vaquero, right? That was cowboy before cowboy became a thing, right? We still use that from time to time. I mean, one of the most popular Ford vehicles, Ford Mustang, Mesteño, that's where it comes from. There used to be a Ford Ranchero, but you might say, well, that's a name. That was actually Spanish. We didn't really think of that as an English name. All right, fair enough. Just like your cattle farmer. Oh, wait, you call him a rancher. That's right, ranchero. But he has a cattle farm. Oh, wait, no, cattle ranch, U.S. Yeah, that's right, ranch. Rancho. Oh, all right, fair enough. And somehow this is still English. That's part of the idea. That's part of the idea behind their argument. And they do, I think, a good job of emphasizing on how Spanglish is really a term of disparagement toward Spanish speakers. There's also variations in phraseology, for example. But again, this is normal. Some people might say, I'll call you back in Spanish. We'll translate it. Te llamo para atrás or te llamo para atrás. Instead of te llamo después, te devuelvo la llamada, te llamo al rato. But it is normal, and even syntax can change. For example, one of the things they mention is the way in Spain, direct and indirect object pronouns, good luck with those in Spain. They don't really follow them. They have a different usage. Let's just say that does not follow the norm, didn't follow the norm. Special rule had to be made to make it acceptable. So even people in Spain can't follow rules? Interesting, right? This happens all the time. Languages do change. They do. But these variations exist. Yet, people like denying that Spanish speakers in the United States just speak a different variety of Spanish. And that is their argument, and that is precisely what they say. Right? When we think of people in Mexico, we say they speak Spanish, and we might say they speak Mexican Spanish or Spanish of Mexico. If we think of Spain, we say they speak Spanish or Castilian. It's the same, right? Mexican Castilian, Spanish Castilian. I'm not saying it's the same between the two countries. What I mean is that saying Spanish and saying Castilian, they're interchangeable. They're the same thing. It would be like saying, I speak Castilian, I speak English, versus I speak British, hablo español, right? If we think about it that way. And I should have another video explaining that. There is another video actually explaining that. So if you go through the channel and look for the difference between Castilian and Spanish, they're the same term, but I go more into detail. But it really is one language with variants and different dialects. Now keep in mind, a dialect is just a variant of a language. It does not mean correct or incorrect. It's just a variant. Similar to how we say aluminum instead of aluminium. It's just a variant. Now really quick, even the English used to say aluminum, but somebody decided that aluminium was closer to Latin and that should be the academic form, and they changed. So it's actually the British who changed, not the Americans. So hybridization, this happens all the time. And this is a good section to read, but I'm going to keep going because I want to get to really the conclusion, or toward the conclusion. Their argument, in just to sum it up, is the following. Using the term Spanglish is a term of disparagement, right? It really does not describe reality because we have not defined that term very well. So potentially it could be anything. Yet, when people in Mexico say un meeting, right? Nobody calls it Spanglish. If you go to Mexico, for example, and you order wings, if they ask you con hueso o boneles, boneless, people don't say, oh, you don't speak Spanish, that's Spanglish. Not really. When people in Spain use English terms, again, nobody says that's Spanglish. People in Argentina, same thing, or any other country for that matter. It's usually a term reserved for Spanish speakers in the United States, obviously including Puerto Rico. But when English speakers take borrowings from Spanish, and I've already mentioned a few, we don't consider that. So then the question I have to you as an English speaker is cilantro. How would you say that in English? Cilantro? Or coriander? It's English. Both of them are English. But think about it a little, right? Other than that, something that they do a very good job, especially here at the end, is just calling it Spanish, right? People in the United States do not speak Spanglish. They speak Spanish. They just speak a different variety, different registry, different academic levels, possibly as well. If one doesn't want to call it Spanish because more specificity is required, as they specify here, they suggest just calling it Spanish of the United States. And I think that's perfectly fine. And that would actually be more accurate, just like we could say Spanish of the United States and maybe more specificity, Spanish of Texas, Spanish of California, Spanish of Southern California, Spanish of the Midwest, right? We can focus on just Chicago. Things like that, similar to how we refer to English, right? English of the United States, English of the Midwest, English of the East Coast, right? English from New Jersey versus New York. Things like that. And the other thing too is to, well, give the opportunity to Spanish speakers to study the language academically, because the reality is that many Spanish speakers in the United States do not have the opportunity to study it academically. Keep in mind, in California, for example, there was a proposition passed in 1998, I believe it was AB 227, which practically prohibited bilingual education in schools, or made it very, very difficult. So this is a whole, these are several generations of students who did not have the opportunity to truly study the Spanish language academically. And now we can't find enough people to fill jobs in the medical field and other professions. Go figure, right? We never trained them. It's going to take us a while, though. But that's the idea behind it, compared to English, where it has a backing, governmental backing, so school. That's generally, school is offered in English, and there are certain requirements and standards for the English language. And that's something to keep in mind. So that being said, I think in general, the authors did a very, very good job of explaining why Spanglish is really not the best term to describe the way Spanish is spoken in the United States. It really is more of a term of disparagement. And one should just recognize that it's a variant of Spanish and allow individuals to study the language further in an academic language to build that capacity and registries, similar to the way one might build one's wardrobe for different occasions. That being said, thank you so much, and I'll catch you in the next video.
Telelingüística.